So you were waiting to ovulate, and then you dragged yourself through the first, maybe second week of the 2-week wait, and then suddenly you get some bleeding, and now you're wondering, am I out? Or, shimmer of hope, could this be implantation bleeding? Hello lovelies, and welcome to another one of my videos in which we'll be taking a closer look at implantation bleeding and how it differs from your period. I mean, not literally, thank you very much. If you want a video like that or a picture like that, then definitely search for it online because there's plenty of that stuff available, but this is not that kind of video. A while back, I did a video on implantation symptoms, and if you want to check that out, then click in the cards up here. And this to date is my most viewed video. However, since then, I'm still getting a lot of questions about a specific implantation symptom, and that is implantation bleeding or implantation spotting. And the biggest question is, how can I tell if it's implantation bleeding or if it is my period that has started? And I did talk a little bit about that in that video, but there's a lot more we can say about it, especially seeing the amount of questions you guys are asking me. So let's cover that in this video. First of all, can I please remind you that implantation bleeding does not happen with every woman and not even with every pregnancy. It happens about 1 in 3. So if you don't get implantation bleeding or spotting, that doesn't mean that you are out. And if you do get spotting or bleeding, again, it doesn't mean that it's implantation bleeding. That's what we'll be talking in this video, right? So the first question I get a lot is what implantation bleeding or spotting looks like color-wise. Well, actually, that's not true. I don't get that question. I get the question, I got some spotting or bleeding that is pink, red, brown, purple, green, yellow, orange. Is this implantation bleeding? Well, I'm going to leave the judgment up to you. The thing is, it's actually pretty tricky. It can almost be every color of the rainbow. Not as extreme as I just said, but it can be watery pink, it can be pinkish, it can even be some red, it can be brownish, it can be rusty looking, it can be watery. It can also really look like cervical mucus that is blood streaked or that has some little red dots in it. The second question I get a lot is, when does implantation bleeding or spotting happen? And again, the question is not usually like that. It's more like, I'm 2 days past ovulation, I'm 6 days past ovulation. My period was due March 4th. And I'm getting bleeding or spotting or whatever. Could it be implantation bleeding? And again, I'm gonna leave it up to you based on this information. So as I explained in that other video, implantation symptoms and all about implantation, implantation happens about 6 to 12 days after an egg and sperm have merged, because that happens around ovulation. So it's about 6 to 12 days after ovulation, because first the egg that has merged with the sperm needs to travel down the fallopian tube before it can actually get to the uterus and then implant. So if you start to get some spotting about 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 days after ovulation, then it definitely could be implantation bleeding. However, you need to be charting to know this, and you know that I encourage you to do so. But if you don't chart, the only way to know if it could possibly be implantation bleeding is to look at when your period is due. If your period isn't due for another week and you have regular cycles and you are getting spotting, then it could possibly be implantation bleeding or implantation spotting. If it's anything besides that, then I'm sorry, you're just gonna have to wait to see if that period becomes full-blown or not. And your next cycle, if it shows up, chart. Another tricky thing about the timing of implantation bleeding is that it can also show up as late as 12 days past ovulation, as I said. This is about 2 days before your period is due. So if you're used to getting spotting 1 or 2 or even 3 days before your period, then it is very difficult to see the difference between your period showing up or it being implantation spotting / bleeding. All right, another clue we can have about whether it's implantation bleeding or not is how heavy it is. Implantation bleeding should not be heavy. As I explained, you've got the egg and the sperm that merge, and then they travel together, this fertilized egg, down the fallopian tube into the uterus. It needs to implant into the uterine wall or your endometrial lining. There are blood vessels going on there. So as it implants, some of those little blood vessels can rupture. and that causes some damage, and that gives you the bleeding. So can you think about how much damage a little egg could do? Not that much that it would be flooding, right? You would actually be expecting some spotting here and there, not much more than that. If your bleeding is more like spotting, and spotting I consider if you can just use a panty liner, that's enough, then it could be implantation bleeding. But if it's a lot more, then it's probably going to be your period. All right, one more clue, and that's about how long implantation bleeding lasts. Again, this is a question I get a lot, and the reason I get that question a lot is probably, again, because it can really vary per woman and per pregnancy. Some may have just a little bit of cervical mucus that is stained. Some may get a little bit of blood and that's it. Some may get spotting for several hours, and some actually get it for several days. And especially when you get it for several days, it might be really confusing whether it's implantation bleeding or your period. And this is why a lot of women might not know that they're pregnant, because they thought that that implantation bleeding for several days was just a really short, weird, light period. Okay, well, if you're still not sure after me answering these questions, let's just talk about when it's probably, most likely, definitely your period. First of all, if you have cramping that is really intense, with implantation bleeding, you can get some cramping, that's fine. But if it's intense like you're used to with your period, sorry girl, not likely implantation bleeding. Secondly, is what I said about the heaviness. And especially if you see that the spotting becomes heavier and heavier and heavier, so it becomes more intense, again, it is your period. It's not implantation bleeding. Implantation bleeding will be a little bit here and there. It can be intermittent, but that's not the case with your period. Thirdly, if you see clots, clots will not happen with implantation bleeding. These are part of your endometrial lining that is being shed during your period. So if you see clots, you're out, sorry. And then there's another clue which you cannot actually tell from your spotting itself, but if you're charting, then you will know. And I also talked about this in the implantation symptoms video, and that is if your temperature dropped. And I had a patient today that doesn't always have a temperature drop before her period, so if you don't usually have that, you can't use this. But if you know that your temperature drops right before your period, which is very likely under the influence of the drop of progesterone, then you know that your period has set in. If your temperature is still high, then you still have a chance. All right, so I had so many more questions about implantation bleeding, but these are the ones that I could cluster together that are really about identifying the difference between implantation bleeding and spotting or your period. However, I want to cover one question because I know you want to know. The question is, if I have implantation bleeding today, when will I get my pregnancy test that is positive, my BFP? And that you can expect in about 3 to 4 days after the first signs of implantation spotting. And the reason for this is that HCG, your pregnancy hormone that's picked up on by your pregnancy test, doesn't actually start to rise after the egg is implanted. So the moment that your egg implants, that won't actually be high yet. You can expect it to rise and rise and rise and the numbers to double. And then after about 3 to 4 days after the first implantation bleeding happened, you can expect a positive test. However, I've had patients that had a positive test the next day. So if you want to peel on a stick, go ahead. So now you know the difference between implantation bleeding / spotting and your period. That is in theory, because I understand in practice it can be a lot trickier. But I do hope by answering these questions more specifically that it will help you identify what's going on for you. And if you want to learn more about implantation and how you can support implantation, then make sure to click on the playlist on your screen right now and you will learn a lot more about it. And if you want to learn more about fertility and boosting it naturally generally, then make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell because I bring out new videos every Thursday. And in the meantime, see you in the next video. Bye!